Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. Welcome to this week's She Rocks. My name is Amy Vaughn, and I am the CEO of this amazing organization, Together Digital, who has a number of thousands of women from across the country who work together to ask, to give, and to grow each and every day. If you're not a part of our community yet, I absolutely recommend you check us out. We have deep, meaningful conversations just like this on every topic that addresses anything in digital or life that women are facing. Visit the website www.togetherindigital.com. As I said, my name is Amy. This is an exciting conversation that we're going to be having today. We're talking with Surabhi Lal about the being the only. As many of you who are probably listening, who saw this event and wanted to join, felt called to it because you know what it's like to sit in a room as the only, or you're a very empathetic ally who is looking to have greater understanding and depth of what it means to be the only. Before we get to that, a few housekeeping things as always. We are live streaming on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Please be sure to comment. Let us know where you're listening from. We love to kind of know, are you a member? Are you not a member? What city are you listening from? We have chapters across the entire country in a community that right now, obviously because of the pandemic, is wholly online. But we would love to know where our audience is listening from. And we love to have a very active participatory audience because, you know, when we do Together Digital content, it's about that two-way conversation. I don't want you to sit here for the next hour and think that you just have to passively listen. If you have something that you want to ask, please put it in the chat. Let us know what you need. We're here for you. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Surabhi on with us as I kind of tell you all a little bit about her and her amazingness. Actually, you know what, Surabhi, I don't like to read bios. And we didn't chat this before, but hopefully you are more than acquainted with yourself. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about you?
Amazing. Thanks, Amy. I often do the same as the person who is moderating, as I feel like there's something about reading a bio in print feels fine, but when the person is on the other side, it feels a little awkward. So thank you first for having me. I'm so excited about this conversation, and certainly am looking forward to hearing from people who are with us participating, what they're feeling. So I'll start by saying I'm an only child. I have lots of experience, many, many years of being an only. And so that really does inform a lot of my work, my empathy, as well as my agency. And I think about that a lot, and we can get into some of those stories. But I am concerned with how we build better workplaces and better communities. And that is very much informed for me by being an only, by being, by really, getting into my empathy and understanding where people are maybe not feeling that sense of belonging, and there are real strategies to do that. So I've been a community builder for new students entering college, so first-year students, which, as you can imagine, is a time of great transition, advising a top university on how to onboard their employees, as well as talking with thousands of job seekers and understanding what makes them feel welcome, as well as employers. And so I think that the workplace has this incredible opportunity, whether you are a solopreneur and that is your workplace, and you are bringing on clients and partners to work with you, or whether you are working at a well-established company with thousands of people across the globe. There is something about that feeling of belonging and connection that is incredibly important, and that work is important. And as building a community at Together Digital, that connectedness and that connectivity among members, between members, you can't leave to chance. And so for me, I really bring both this sense of only and belonging to all of those conversations. And I do think that workplaces have this incredible opportunity to increase community in their workplace, to bring people together from very, very different life experiences. And if done well, can be incredibly transformative, not only for the work and the work product, but for our larger communities.
That's amazing. What fun work that is. I feel like you and I probably vibe well that way because I do thrive off of that ever since I was a child. Like I was always creating clubs and, activities for groups. And it was always very important to me that people felt like they belonged. I have no clue why. I'm actually the oldest of three, so I didn't have that opportunity to be the only for very long, at least that I can remember. But I think like what you're doing in the conversation and the way that you're having it, I think is really unique, because it's empowering a little bit of those people who are the only, to give them, like you said, agency and voice. So, since we're talking about that tension between being the only, which means sometimes being the outsider, or could feel like being the outsider, when we all desire belonging, how have you personally experienced this tension, and how might others make note of others who are feeling this so that we can be there and show up for them the way we ought to?
Yeah. So like I said before, I'm an only child. So I have a lot of experience being an only, but not only am I an only child, I'm the only child in my generation who was born and brought up in the States. So my cousins, and I'm close with so many of them, but they were all born and brought up in India. And so I lived this life where I spent most of my time during the year in suburban DC, but I spent these really transformative summers in India. And in India, I wasn't an only kid in the house because I was with all of my cousins, but I was the only one experiencing the world in that way because they were all there, right? I was visiting, I was there. And the other piece for me is that it played into some really interesting events. So one, I had to translate what was going on for myself. And I had to, in many ways, be my own best friend around understanding what is going on and asking questions. And I think that made me a really keen observer. And that's what deepened some of my empathy. So certainly growing up, where there was this sense of, wow, I'm the only person who looks like me at school. And now I'm going to go to India where everyone looks like me, but I'm the only one with this different life experience and this different perception of what was my daily life than trying to understand a different daily life, but also loving the fact that I was part of a gaggle of kids who would run around, and it made me wonder what it was like to have many siblings and to have somebody to share in that relationship with. So I think that is one piece. And the way it played out as I got older, when I was in 5th grade, we moved to a different neighborhood. And I was really, from that point forward, really one of the only ones who looked like me in my classes. Yeah. And I was precocious and asked a lot of questions. I was brought up by parents who said, you should ask questions. You should think critically. As you can imagine, when you are the only, that also comes with some cost benefit analysis of, do I raise my hand? Do I not raise my hand? Do I bring this up? Do I not bring this up? What are other people going to think of me? Which I think is a question that many people will say, well, I don't care what other people think of me. But the truth is, in some ways, we all think about what other people think of us, because that's the belonging piece, right? If I say something that's too far outside of the norms, am I not going to belong? So in high school, I asked some questions like, how come we're studying in a class called World Civilization, but really should be called Western Civilization?
Oh, right.
So a lot of kind of questioning some of the power and assumptions that were made in the world. And I thought, okay, well, that came at a cost. But for me, I really just was curious and I wanted to know.
Yeah.
And so that kind of only and belonging, I belong to all these multiple communities, and also felt like an only for a long time. And I would say for me, the only gives me a ton of power, because I have had a lot of practice being the only, that I am the only one who's going to look at myself in the mirror and say, how, did you do right by your integrity today? Right. So to me, it's much more important to use my agency in line with my integrity than to be lonely. And I think part of that is because I've had so much experience being an only, that I know what loneliness is like. I know what connection is like. And I don't think it's a bad thing. And I think a lot of people say, oh, lonely, only, blah, blah, blah. And I think lonely, only, that's a source of power, right? That's a source of being able to say, you know what, something going on here isn't right. And if the worst thing that happens to me is that I am ostracized and then feel lonely in that moment, I'll take it. Yeah. For me, it drives a lot of my agency and wanting to raise my hand and ask those difficult questions. And so I think not only did it give me this deep sense of empathy, it also made me a very keen observer. And so, the second part of your question around how might others make note of this feeling is to be a really keen observer. I think this has been much harder this past year on Zoom. You can't really tell in the same way. We know that 95% of how we communicate is nonverbal and not what comes out of our mouth. And I think on Zoom, you see and hear so much of what comes out of people's mouth, but you don't see all of their body language. And so because I was trying to be my own translator growing up, I realized that I could be a really keen observer.
Yeah.
And so I think so much of understanding what's going on in a community is to sit back and observe.
Yeah.
Certainly to participate, but observation is part of participation as well. And then to notice and say, hey, Amy, you were really quiet today. That's unlike the way you're normally in meetings. Is something going on? And so that's that caring piece of like bringing the belonging part in. And then, like I said, I think for me, the only is both this sense of giving me a keen sense of observation, a keen sense of empathy, because I think you need to be able to observe to be empathic, and you need to be able to listen. And then you also need to be able to act, and that's the agency, and know when to act in certain ways, right? So whether it is really having that, like, hey, there's an uncomfortable, I just want to notice there's an uncomfortable silence in the room and see what comes up of that, or to do it more individually, like my earlier example, in approaching you. I think that is one of the big ways within our teams, for example, that you can build that sense of belonging.
No, definitely.
You don't have to be the person in power. You don't have to have the title.
Right.
This is something that anybody can do from their seat.
Well, because I think what you've just said there, the long and short of it really is that how your onlyness, what makes you different brings, like you said, empathy. It brings perspective, the opportunity to ask questions that nobody else may think to ask, to look for things that nobody else is thinking to look for. Like, totally relate to your, the Western civilization class versus world civilization class. My father is Egyptian, and it was like, we never learned anything about the other side of the world. And I knew it existed. A lot of my classmates maybe did not. And it was always interesting. Like, we would maybe learn about the Romans, and that's about, as far as it got. And so it was really, I think what you're saying, I agree with you. And that's why I wanted to have you on this, is because I do think your perspective and this, you can look at it one of two ways. You can look at your onlyness as, a downside and something that you should be like, not embracing. But I really do think that you embrace it in such a beautiful way with these tips of leveraging your perspective to ask questions, using your empathy to read the room better than maybe anybody else can. And like you said, it doesn't matter your title. Like, you have that superpower as soon as you walk in. Like, they need you more than you need them. And I just think that that's really awesome and empowering. So I love, love, love your perspective on all of this. But on that note, I do know that sometimes it can get tiring, right? Like, a lot of times, in the workplace specifically, being the only in that kind of environment starts to spark feelings of what feels like tokenism. You can start to feel marginalized, or just there because you fit like the D&I like quota, whatever that might be. It can be draining and depleting, because also you may be asked often, as many folks know, to be the one to educate everyone else on what it's like to be X, Y, and Z, to be the only. For those who know this feeling all too well, which might be some who are listening today, what are some ways in which they can turn those negative feelings into some sort of positive change, maybe even for themselves, not just like the rest of the group, but for themselves?
Yeah, the tokenism piece, I think, is real, right? Especially if you feel like you are being brought in specifically for optics. Let me put it that way, right? Yeah. For optics, for something performative. And sometimes people will tell you, I've heard from so many people, they'll say, oh, well, you got this job because you are fill in the blank, whatever the blank is at that particular place. And that isn't starting from a place of belonging, right? That is actually starting from a place of othering. as opposed to belonging. And it also doesn't value the fact that that somebody might have an incredibly rich perspective and a different perspective that could be helpful across the board. So that piece does not feel good, I think, and it's actually not productive for the entire team. But I think if you start to feel that as a pattern, then that may not be a place for you.
Yeah.
I mean, in just very, very simple terms, right? That may not be the place for you. Unfortunately, for many people, it doesn't mean you can move tomorrow. So it means, how do you figure out coping while you are in that place of being the token or the only, and also understanding what your boundaries are. So, you know, Amy, to use your example, if somebody would say, hey, so your dad's Egyptian, can you tell me, have you been to, I'm sure this has happened to you, but like, have you been to the pyramids? Can you read hieroglyphics? Can you tell me all the ancient myths?
Yeah.
And there's an incredible, I think, both as someone who's proud of their cultural heritage, there is a sense of, yeah, you might want to share that, but there's also a sense of, why are you asking me that? Like, do you really care who I, Amy, am?
Yeah.
Or are you only interested in me, Amy, because I can give you this information? And so I do think that people who fall into this only tokenism, there is a sense in our guts that kicks in that's like, okay, this person is interested and we can have a very real conversation. Or this person maybe isn't so interested and this is tokenism, and I need to figure out how to answer that question. So one, I say pay attention to your body. If your body is sending out all the alarms and there's that pit in your stomach and all of the signs that are going on wherever they go on in your body, that you have some lines that you've practiced, which is like, it's so great that you are interested in Egypt. You know, I'd recommend this book. It was really helpful to me. You were helpful. You were done with the conversation. It doesn't need to go any further. So I think understanding where some of your boundaries are and how you are then going to respond. And so one of the things that happened to me a lot is I would sometimes go into places and people be like, oh, where are you from? We'll talk about that. Where are you from? No, where are you really from? But when I'd say India, they're like, oh, I've always wanted to go. And so it becomes this whole like, can you tell me all your travels? I'm like, you know what? This isn't the purpose of our conversation or meeting. There are tons of great resources and documentaries. You know, there's no dearth of information about any of these things. And if you want to know who I am and how that has shaped my life, then let's talk. So I do think figuring out, one, listen to your body, two, have some lines practice that you feel like, this is my boundary, I'm putting it up, because it is also, it's very much about protecting yourself and your energy. And then it starts to be a little less depleting. I wouldn't say it's any less annoying. But it doesn't, I think, pull the energy in those ways. And you can feel like, you know what? I put a boundary for myself. And there's a really good feeling about that.
No, I love that. That's definitely taking that negative and putting it into a positive, because I love that this comes up often in our conversations lately is, you know, just paying attention. And I love that you said, listen to your body. I don't think we ever, because we're always thinking, note how certain things feel until we start to become aware. And that's how you kind of know. I love that, to then kind of defer to your a little bit of autopilot, like you said, to protect that energy, because it can be sometimes an exhausting experience to have to be kind of having those things brought to you time and time again. So I think that's wonderful advice. Something else that you said kind of sparked and reminded me of a recent podcast that I listened to with Adam Grant. If you're familiar with him and his work. Yeah, same too. He's organizational psychologist, and he works out of Horton and is a speaker, author, but he's doing a podcast now, and the one is called Work Life. And he talks about this one about, I'm pretty sure it's recent. It's like how to rethink bad decisions. And I'm mentioning that because There was one in particular where a woman of color was brought into a large organization and made her way through and was just running up against a wall, really trying to get them to truly embrace not just diversity, but equity and inclusion, and just kept running up against that same wall. And she had some really good advice on how to recognize and note that time and how to make a plan to kind of thereafter depart in a manner that felt good for her and that worked well for the company. And just really knowing when you just need to stop trying to fight for that and just like save yourself and walk away. And it doesn't mean that like you're giving up. I found that hard. It felt like giving up sometimes, because I wasn't just there fighting for myself. I was there fighting for others. But there comes a point when you have to say, like, there's just some things that I cannot have in my power to change, and it's healthier and better for me to walk away.
100%. And I think that it is harder to think about walking away, particularly now. And I think particularly for women, like I want to acknowledge that. And I am also really hopeful that this is a better time to walk away because you can walk away and have a gap.
Yeah.
It was because of the pandemic.
Right.
And so, you don't have to get into that in the same way. But I also, some people might have to be in I need this job and I need to figure out what the coping is going to be. Definitely. I would also say that if you have colleagues or if you are a colleague of someone who gets a dreaded question often, really engage in supporting that person, which is to say, that person could step in and say, it's really interesting you asked Amy that question.
Right.
I'm wondering what prompted that. And so it takes the responsibility off of you because in that moment, you've got all the stuff in your body. But your colleague could be an amazing ally in that moment and just mark the question. And one, it'll give you a little time. But two, it'll cause the other person to think, did I do that? Is there a reason that I did that? Why is a go-to question? And I do think that many, many people ask questions solely out of curiosity, and they don't realize the impact that it's going to have on someone else. And it gives, you're this third person in this conversation, say it was me, it would give you a beat to think, and it just gives everybody a minute. In that moment. So I also, if you're not that person, but you have a colleague who gets some of these dreaded questions and that they're dreaded questions for them.
No, I love that. I love questioning the questions. I was going to say that earlier. Like, I think I've done that a few times when I've been asked questions, like even just a gender-based type one or something that I'm like, would you be asking me that? Or would you be telling me this if I was XYZ, usually white male? And I'm like, oh no. Oh, okay. And usually I have a good rapport with these people. We have mutual respect. But like you said, a lot of it's just sometimes blind ignorance or unconscious bias.
Totally.
And you're honestly, if it makes you feel bad at all and it makes you feel confrontational, I've always thought, if anything, like I'm helping them. I'm giving them an opportunity to acknowledge the behavior patterns that they unconsciously have so that the next time maybe they think twice about it. So I think that is wonderful advice. For, those who are the only, but then definitely allies. Like, oh my gosh, I think I would like reach over and if I could pre-COVID, give a big old hug to a person that stepped up and did that for me to say, why did you do that? Why would you ask that of her? And I'd be like, oh, thank you.
Thank you. Right. Like it just gives a little bit of relief. So I think, all of us have a role that we can play, in that conversation. And I think for many people, like the where are you from, which I had said tongue in cheek, but it's really not tongue in cheek, is a question that's followed me forever. And it is often followed by, no, where are you really from? And in my younger years, I used to be like, oh, I'm from Washington, D.C. Well, where are you really from? Actually, I'm really from the suburbs. I used to live, so I would just start answering the question.
Right.
Well, ultimately, what people wanted to know is that your family's from Indian origin. And I remember very clearly, and I don't remember who it was, but I remember stopping the first time somebody asked me, what's your cultural heritage, and didn't ask me where I was from. And I thought, that is a very different question. And I can get to that answer. But it was the intention in which they took to change up the question. So it didn't end up in this othering sort of space. And so when you say, where are you really from, you're kind of making it othering as opposed to inviting in a question. And I just remember, I think I must have looked like a fish, like eyes wide open and my mouth hanging open, because nobody had asked me the question in that way.
Right.
And I was just so struck by that. And it just didn't put me on the defensive in the same way.
Exactly. Well, I mean, on that note, if you can think of any other examples or strategies that can help others start to implore empathy from others who do not share their experiences, because I think one of the greatest journeys that I think I've had over the years is really taking time to have deep and meaningful relationships. Maybe I'm answering the question, sorry. Deep and meaningful relationships with people who are different than me, so that I can learn and see from their experiences. I mean, outside of that, like, what are some ways that we can do to just make ourselves a little bit more educated and informed? Because I think a lot of what we're talking about right now are microaggressions. And I'm sure most of you who are sitting here on the call today listening are familiar with what that is. If you're not, it's like we usually coin it death by 1,000 cuts. It's all those little jabs, those assumptions about a person based on how they look or where they might have come from. It's those questions, all those things kind of every day, day in and day out. So that sense of, belonging just kind of always gets more and more withered away. What are some strategies that those who want to increase their allyship can do to start to get a better understanding of that?
Yeah, so I think that you need to understand your own feelings, one, to get to empathy.
Yep.
And that can be a process. Some people have been told all their life they're too sensitive, to which I say empathy is your superpower. I'm certainly in that camp of like, I've always been told I'm too sensitive. And then about 10 years ago, I was like, no, we're going to turn this around. And it's going to become, this is my superpower. I can actually feel what other people are feeling. And that is an amazing power and can be incredibly useful. So I think, one, understand your own feelings, which means understand how you feel in certain situations, because that is one of the bridges to empathy. If you are a reader, fiction, and my dear friend Maribel Lara was one of the first people who posed this in this way to me, but like, fiction is an amazing way to build your empathy. Because you can read somebody else's story, you can start to feel what that person is feeling. You kind of become one with that character. And along with that, hearing other people's stories is another way to do that.
Definitely.
I don't think you can be practicing empathy as a daily practice unless you are also actively listening. And that is hard. There's so much noise in our heads, in the world. It means being able to be present and listen to the person in front of you. And that can take practice, right? That can take a ton of practice of just sitting. And I think really, for me, I would much prefer to do it person to person on the phone and not necessarily on Zoom, but I have also had to do it in the past year on Zoom, and I don't think that's going away, right? I don't think that's going away. So figure out what you need. Does that mean that if you are going to go into a conversation with somebody and you're going to be really present, that you need to take 10 or 15 minutes before to reset yourself? Do it. So make those 50-minute meetings instead of an hour-long meeting, so you have those 10 minutes in between. But I think reading, I think knowing your feelings, understanding your own emotions and what's coming up is an incredibly important part of building empathy. And then listening and putting some of the things that are going on your head, to not be like, oh, Amy, let me solve that for you right now. Say, Amy, I'm wondering, what do you need from me in this moment? Are you interested in hearing some thoughts that I have, or do you want me to sit with you? Right? So you can ask those questions, and then I'm giving you the power to choose. And you might say, you know what, I'd love to hear your advice, but tomorrow. I'd be like, great, we'll talk about it tomorrow.
Yes. I think, I love that, Surabhi. I have been trying to implore that more when somebody approaches and says that they need, or they're just in a moment. What do you need me here for? Do you want ideas, thoughts, solutions, pep talk? Do you just want me to listen? Like, I'm happy to do that, because we've all been there. I'm sure most of us listening right now, sometimes solving isn't what you need. To just be in that moment and feeling what you're feeling is so important. And then also, like you said, it's equally as important for that person to be able to sit and listen. It reminded me of the Fred Rogers quote, Mr. Rogers, of once you know somebody's story, you can't help but fall in love with them. I've always loved that quote, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. Stories is absolutely a fabulous way to start to broaden your perspective and your horizons and your understanding and empathy for others. So that was all super stellar advice. Next question. As we're kind of talking about, what this is like in the workplace and having these experiences in the workplace, I know not everybody listening has the influence to maybe impact their organizations, but if they do, how can organizations build what you have described as these communities of belonging? I think our society and our structures of corporate world haven't been modeled this way. So what are some things that you think organizations need to do to start moving towards that community of belonging?
Yeah, so let me start with one of the things. When I think about communities of belonging, I don't think about communities where everybody looks the same, acts the same, and comes with the same life experience. And so, as you were saying, the companies that exist now were actually built on the premise that most of the people who are working there, particularly in non-support roles, were going to be men who had support at home for their their families or no families. So they didn't have a ton of family obligations or caretaking obligations. And that's who organizations were built for, right? That's just the history of work in many corporate settings. And that the people who were supporting them were generally women, were generally other people that maybe did have caretaking responsibilities and were also caretaking at work. So that is not what just to be clear, that's not what I'm talking about when we talk about communities of belonging, but I do think it's important to understand the structures that have built the organizations in which many people work today. And so now we are trying to retrofit what was built with a different set of diversity, inclusion, equity, initiatives. And for me, part of the conversation is communities of belonging. So I think it is inherently unjust for us to bring in people with different experiences if we're not ready to support those people with different experiences and to help them succeed.
Yeah.
So we can't, that's a Band-Aid approach. It's not going to be a long-term solution. So these communities of belonging are the sense of how do we build structures so that people can co-create? So how can I take Amy's experience, my experience, somebody else's experience, and have them all be equally valued, which takes work because it means I need to get to know you and you need to get to know me, and we need to get to know our other team members to be able to do that. And that we are all driven by a common purpose, and that purpose is the thing that tethers us to each other. But we can come from incredibly different backgrounds, experiences, life experiences, and bring that to the table. And actually that is what's going to make us better. So the community of belonging is really centered around, this is the work that we're going to do together, and we are committed to that work. And you might be committed to that work because it's a paycheck. I might be committed to that work because it's a calling, and someone else might be committed to that work for another reason. They just like us, so they want to work with us, right? Whatever the reason is. And that is okay, that we can hold space for all of those different reasons for being there. But it does require a lot more work. And so we know that there is a business case for diversity, and we can read all about that in places like Harvard Business Review and other studies. But that building that community doesn't happen just because we're all in the same room or Zoom room or Slack together. It happens intentionally. It happens because someone in the group is building that connectivity. Someone is talking about, what about this work is exciting to you? What about this is moving you? How might you bring your experience from somewhere else to here, instead of saying, here's what you need to do, and go do it. So it is this, instead of saying, here's what you need to do, it's how can we create this together to do what we want to do? So it is a real reframe.
I like that a lot.
Thinking about an organization.
That makes a lot of sense, because I'm kind of curious, as you're talking about like your thoughts on things like employee resource groups and things like that.
So employee resource groups can be incredibly powerful, right? We know in large organizations, you might be an only. And one of the things that an employee resource group does is helps you find other people who are having similar experiences, but aren't in your division. They aren't in your unit. They may not even be in your city.
Right.
But now there's a place for you to gather. There's a place to say, this happened to me. Is this happening to you too? And there is incredible power in realizing, okay, it isn't all in my head, right? This is happening around me. Let me trust that. But also when this happens, do I have support of somebody else? And so there's this sense of we need to be with people who have some similar shared experiences, and we need to be with people who don't. And so I think employee resource groups can be incredibly helpful and powerful for finding that place of, I can let my guard down a little bit, and I can hear these other experiences, and a great place of storytelling, of feeling like, okay, this has happened to you too. Great. What strategy did you use? And I have a resource now and I can do that. But also from a more political advocacy perspective, instead of being a 1-1-1-1-1 in multiple places, now you are a collective group and a collective voice. And so you can start to push and move policy within an organization. So I think they can be incredibly, incredibly powerful for that. I think they can be incredibly powerful for finding relationships and networks to help people individually move to different parts of an organization. And collectively, they can also be a force for education so that doesn't fall solely on one person. I do think the best employee resource groups are, in fact, resourced.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's where I struggled in the past, was that where the employees themselves who are already bearing the work of their normal job, plus being the educators and the onlys, are then like, oh, well, you get to be the employee resource group and you get to create the content and facilitate the conversation. And then it's like, wait, I'm just going and finding solutions for my own problems, which is fine, but it's taking time out of and personally, I've always been passionate about it. So it was never really a question for me, but I know there was lots of other people who were, maybe just as impassioned, but also more worried about their paycheck and didn't want to commit time or effort to it, and for fear of falling behind in what their work was. So, yeah.
Yeah, completely. And so resource could look like a lot of different things. It could look like, we're going to build this into your job description, right? So in a performance review, hey, Amy, you are a leader on the employee resource group. You've been doing a lot of work. So we're going to shift around some of your role responsibilities and include this. It could be payment. It could be straight up, great. This is a value to the organization. And so we are going to show that to you in terms of real dollars. But I think that they have to be resourced.
They
have to have power. They have to be resourced. It can't solely feel like a support group, though the support of the group is a critical piece of the work.
No, I agree. Well, and I think it puts their, I guess, for lack of a better term, it puts their money where their mouth is. Like, it's like they're willing to not just invest time, but also money into making sure that there are adequate resources for those employees who are in need of it. So yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with you on the whole thing about ERGs. I was just kind of curious. I know we didn't have that question in there, but I was curious for anybody who's listening. And again, I have past experience in working with those environments, and it can be challenging sometimes. So if you're working for it, I think all the advice that you gave earlier makes a lot of sense about ways to reinforce it and make it stronger and more productive, which is ultimately the goal, right? That's awesome.
Right. And we've seen a lot of ERGs that are doing cross ERG work as well, which has been incredible, right? When it comes to advocacy within the organization and an internal push to say, you're not doing enough to foster equity. You're talking about equity, but you're not doing enough. And here's a voice, and these are legitimate, right? I think that's part of the other thing that an ERG does, is make people's experiences, and it shouldn't have to be this way. Frankly, if we were closer to a community of belonging, an individual's experience would be really important and really valued. But I think ERGs allow for some experiences to be heard as more legitimate.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's so cool. I love it. So in a little bit of what I was listening to and reading up about you, and by the way, I recommend all of you follow Surabhi on LinkedIn. She also has a LinkedIn Live series where there's lots of phenomenal conversation happening every week as well. But what parts of yourself, your story, and your voice do you find it most important to share when you're defining your leadership style? Because you talk about a lot about how all of this and being the only has really helped shape how you lead. I'm just curious about that.
No, it's such a great question. So I think that being an only, and certainly being an only, being bicultural, meaning, having this foot in two worlds, are very much a part of my leadership. I mean, they are in many ways some of the foundations of my leadership. And part of it, the other piece of it, which is related, is that I was exposed to seeing inequity very, very early in my childhood. And I always knew that I wanted to do work that made an impact, and an impact on people's lives. And so it was never, for me, work was always about that impact. How can you impact people's lives? How can you make their lives better? So whether that is from a policy or structural level or person to person, that has been really part of my personal purpose and the work that I do. And so I've always sought out positions where that was the case. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece is kind of being in this only belonging tension or limbo, and also what does it mean to have a foot in two worlds and not fully planted in either, but fully planted in both, has been very, very key to my leadership style. And I think this is something that has really helped me understand people who have incredibly different life experiences, but a similar, I feel in and I feel out. So whether that is talking, and again, this is around the empathy, and my being too sensitive, or my empathy superpower, is the sense that, when I had friends in college who were coming out, I could relate to that experience of, I'm afraid to tell somebody that this is what it is because I might be ostracized, or I kind of feel like I'm included, but I don't feel like I'm included. That wasn't my experience and hasn't been my experience as a cisgendered woman. And it hasn't been my experience, but there was something about that experience that I could relate to. And I think that one of the things in leadership is knowing yourself. And so as somebody who spent a lot of time with myself, I know myself pretty well. And the other piece of it is being a keen observer and the person who looks for those connections. So how can those connections be made, and how can I bring myself into that connection or understand what that might feel like? Or at least can't understand fully what that's like. That hasn't been my experience. But I can imagine what that might feel like in a very real way. And I can imagine what other things feel like. And I think the seeing inequities really also helped me think about systems. So both from an interpersonal level, and also we don't exist without the systems around us and without the cultures around us. So I do think that a lot of it is the sense of being the in-between. So a foot in both, but not 2 feet in either, has been a big part of defining my leadership, and then getting my hands around the empathy and agency, and how both of them stem from the same place.
I can only imagine. Right. And I can only imagine just like how it feels to show up to a place where it's being led by someone who kind of embraces their onlyness or differences, and does it in a way that is awe-inspiring, because it's that whole notion of that when you are embracing your life and your differences, you're allowing others to do the same. It's like you being that liberated in the way you behave as a leader, or as you're working towards your leadership style, that is allowing them to be and feel comfortable about being themselves. And that's like one thing I've been very much the same. Even my 7-year-old daughter, I'm always telling her, like, weird is wonderful. Like, I want you to be different and interesting. Like, we have so much to learn from one another. And I think if we all show up trying to be uniform and alike and the same, we won't have anything to learn from each other. And so anytime I see somebody, I've always been more as personally attracted to leaders, and more likely to follow leaders who are willing to be vulnerable and empathetic, but then also feel comfortable and free to kind of show their differences and how that's made them who they are. Because again, it gives me something to learn, but it also empowers me to just like suck it up and do the same, and not feel so shy about sharing some of my weirdness. So I think that that's so wonderful. I love that. I want to see more of that in our leadership in the world for sure.
Yeah. And I think for me too, the integrity piece is important, right? We hear a lot about authenticity, and Adam Grant actually talks about authenticity as well. And when can you be authentic and not? He actually has a great session, a great episode on that in his Work Life podcast, and about who gets to be authentic, right? In our society, who gets to be authentic, and what happened. And spoiler alert, if you seemingly have more power, you get to be more authentic.
Yes.
And for me, I feel like I can't be authentic if my integrity is challenged.
Yeah.
And that's, again, like, that's something that I have felt for a really long time. And I personally am willing to take the loss on one side to keep my integrity intact.
Right.
And I have been able to do that, but I also want to recognize that for many people, that hasn't always been the case. And I think just being really, really clear. And so one of the things in all of the job seekers that I've worked with, I've said to them, like, look, you have a choice to make. You can either stay, even when your integrity is challenged, but know the reason that you're staying. Is it the paycheck? Is it the connections? Is it the experience?
Yep.
Amazing.
Right.
You can choose to leave, right? And just say, I'm done. This isn't the place for me. Or you can choose to fight from inside.
Yeah.
And you may be in all three of those points in the same position over the course of different points in time.
Yeah.
But to be clear where you are on that.
That's such good advice. Yes, being clear where you are. That does remind me. I don't know if you listened to that with the other. It sounds like we all need to go back and keep listening to more of Work Life, because I'm going to listen to the other one too. But that was one thing she was talking about, was realizing and recognizing where she was and where she would want to be and what were her values. And I think sometimes too, in the thick of work and culture and interaction with people, which I know it's so different now than what it was when we were in person, but it's gonna go back, right, at some point. Is that, if you haven't sat down and really done that work for yourself, it's really hard for you. If you don't know what you stand for, then they say, if you don't know what you stand for, you'll stand for nothing. And so it's so easy in certain work environments that can become, increasingly toxic, especially for people who are within the minority, to kind of just become numb to it. So I do think that your advice on being kind of very self-aware, knowing what your values are and where you stand, and having a plan for those conversations when they happen, kind of gets to our last question, because I wanted to ask this because I feel like there's probably, I know I've been here before, and I know if I've approached it, and sometimes it's a good way, and sometimes it's maybe like, oh, should have done that differently. There's a lesson learned. But when we're trying to make space for hard conversations, either as an ally or as the inflicted person, how can we work to make them less difficult for us and for that person who maybe we have to sit down and be like, okay, listen. So what advice do you have for someone who is trying to have what may be a very challenging conversation when dealing with sexism or racism in the workplace?
So I start with this. Have your cheerleaders and boosters around you.
Yeah.
So, let people know, listen, I'm going to have some difficult conversations, and I might need to call you in tears one day. I just want you to have a heads up about what's going on. Or say, listen, I would love it if you could check in on me in the next few weeks. So I think it's really important to have your boosters and cheerleaders around you, so that they can help pump you up when you're not feeling great about this conversation. And your difficult conversation could go incredibly well. It's still going to be helpful to have a booster around you to say, you did it, or this was so important, right? So your trusted people around you, your cheerleaders, the people who are going to say, all right, let's sit and watch Netflix together, or let's do something completely outside of this, so that you're not thinking about it all the time. Or who send you whatever treat, flowers, whatever it is that's going to brighten your day. So I think it's really helpful if you know that you're stepping into a series of those conversations, you're going to have one, put some support around you. And if it's not other people, maybe it's something that you do for yourself. So you are going out for a walk around the block, or you're going to cook yourself your favorite meal, or whatever it is. So support yourself in whatever way makes sense. I think understanding what you want out of the difficult conversation is also important. So are a lot of ways to have a difficult conversation. I think you can start with this is how you made me, this is how I feel when you do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you start with the I. It takes a little bit of practice to do.
Yeah.
And nobody can argue with your feelings. Though people will say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. And I think this happens to women a lot, right? I'm sure, Amy, you've heard this in your life. Well, Amy, why do you feel that way? That's not what I meant. You shouldn't feel that way.
Right.
And it comes out just like that, kind of
Mm-hmm.
demeaning of that. And I think you be prepared to say, my feelings are mine, and I'm telling you how I felt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just stick by that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's challenging to start the conversation, particularly when there are power dynamics involved. So if you're trying to have this conversation with a supervisor, for example, it can be a real challenge. Sometimes it's helpful to ask some questions and understand what the supervisor is thinking about. One of the great things about asking questions is, one, you're getting a ton more information. You're being curious, and you're allowing yourself some time to pull in information and not necessarily be the person who's initiating.
Right.
So again, having some questions that are the ones that are your go-to questions. So Amy, can you tell me more about that? Can you help me understand? This is one of my favorite ones. Can you help me understand how you came to this?
Yeah.
Right. And it sounds, I have to say, when you start practicing them, they sound very contrived.
Mm-hmm.
And they sound really fake.
Mm-hmm.
And I always think this is one of the ways that we can can be a learned behavior to ask those questions. And what I always think about is how it's going to be heard on the other end. Because when I want to say, what the heck were you thinking when you did X, Y, and Z?
Right.
That if I reframe that to say, can you help me help me understand your way of thinking to get to this point? The latter might feel more contrived and maybe not as authentic as the first one, but the results that it may pull out is going to be better. And so in some ways, using some of these tactics that have been studied can be really, really helpful, particularly in a workplace. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of those conversations come out of people who have been in power for a long time.
Yeah.
And in general, people are not ready to have deep conversations about sexism, racism, because they are ingrained, because there are messages all around us, and because some of the worst things you can be in the world are sexist and racist, and you don't want to be labeled that.
Sure, exactly.
So one of the things you could do is to say, I experienced this as racism, or I experienced this as a racist behavior. As opposed to saying you did something racist.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a very subtle change in language, but it can open a door to conversation.
Right.
And I think there are far too many women who are calling out sexism and far too many people of color who are calling out racism, and that's the job of everyone. So everyday sexist acts happen, everyday racist acts happen, and it takes everyday people, all of us, to bring those to the surface.
Light. No, I definitely agree. I think there's something too, I've had some really good conversations with a friend and former speaker here at Together Digital, who does a lot of, she studied diversity, equity, inclusion at Harvard and is using VR for experiencing sort of the microaggressions of minority groups throughout a scenario. And we were talking a lot about this. I think it was before She Rock, so it didn't actually get recorded. We were just talking about how it is a challenge because, everyone gets triggered, and that includes the person that you are bringing your concern and experience to. So I think your reframing is really helpful, because one of the challenges I think a lot of us have maybe faced is that what you're afraid of is you are going to share your experience and what it was, and they're going to get defensive and dismiss it because they feel like, oh, I'm not broken, I'm not wrong, or brush off your feelings and say, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. I think that the way you're talking and the reframing could be really helpful in sort of working around that instance or that fear of being rejected just because somebody gets defensive and they don't want to be labeled as those things. Because again, like you said, I hope nobody wants to be, nobody that I'm working with wants to be labeled that. So I think that's some really fabulous advice. And like I said, I've sat in rooms for those uncomfortable situations and conversations before. And all I can tell you, for those of you who are on the fence about having them, I have never once regretted it, because really how they respond and react and what comes after that tells you a lot of what you need to know about whether you should be staying or going from a place, quite honestly. So for those of you who are still struggling with that, maybe, we have our Asks channel on Slack. Our members use it pretty regularly. In fact, I've seen this a lot on our Mansplain channel, where women are like, I'm experiencing this. How the heck do I even begin to address this? Or they just need to kind of get the steam and the anger out, because, we're all different sort of vibes. Like, some of us go towards like, I'm an Enneagram 9, so I'm just like, no conflict. Let's go over here. Like, look at this. Let's all work together and be happy again. And then there's other people who are just like, they're honked off, they're mad, and they come into a room, and that person that they're about ready to have a conversation with is like, oh, I know something's up. Like,
Right.
this, and they are on the defensive before they've opened their mouth. So I think, like you said, rallying your people before you have these conversations, whichever of those camps you fall into, I think that's such great advice, because I've definitely seen some of our members use Slack to kind of do that whole, I got to blow off steam so I can just keep my cool when I have to talk to this so-and-so.
Yes, completely. I think the other thing that's important to notice is that you are going to notice the behavior and the pattern of behavior because you have seen it in multiple iterations throughout your life. And for someone else, it may be an isolated incident. So if something happened between us, right? We'll go back to the where are you from? Like, if you ask me where you're from and I roll my eyes, you might say, I'm just asking a curious question. And in my head, I'm saying, this is the 1,000th time someone has asked me this question. Mm-hmm. And I think recognizing that, for me, I see that as a pattern, and I see that as a pattern of this. And that when you bring it, when I would say to you, Amy, like, what did you really mean by that? That you might say, what do you mean? I didn't even know that was like, you didn't have any sense of what the impact of that would be. And it's important for you to recognize that the impact of that was what it was. Yeah. And if we're going to create these communities of belonging, it really is also centering the way that people feel, and that people need to feel, and Amy Edmondson has great research around psychological safety, that part of this is about having that basic psychological safety that we can then get into difficult conversations, because you are not going to disrespect my humanity in this conversation. And you could say, wow, it's a question I ask everybody, but I didn't realize that it might land for you differently than it lands for someone else. Mm-hmm. So then you're taking responsibility for it.
Yes. Yeah, I heard that somewhere recently, or read it somewhere. I've been listening and reading so much, I can't remember where this one was from, but it was something about the fact that, like, harmony and peace only comes when both sides take 100% responsibility. And so I feel like a little bit of what you were saying there is that it seems like a weird thing to have to do when you clearly are the one that is having this like repetitive microaggression pattern towards. But by finding some agency and having the voice and the ability to speak up about it, but then also like share that responsibility to some degree by speaking up, I think it's just, I don't know. I thought it reminded me of that. It was really cool. Awesome. Well, we have just got a few seconds left. This hour went so fast. This was such a, important and meaningful conversation. I think all of your advice was just absolutely fabulous. I love all the work that you're doing. So hopefully, please keep in touch, everybody. Surabhi, if you want to connect with her, hopefully you don't mind. They connect with you on LinkedIn.
Please do.
Listen to her show as well, and her stories as well. It's just been great getting to spend the hour with you. I appreciate it.
Amy, thank you so much for the invitation. And I definitely invite the community to come to LinkedIn and listen to stories of leadership. So I do a session called Sips and Leadership on LinkedIn, Wednesdays, midday Eastern time at 12:30. And people who are in social impact and public service and have amazing stories of change and community and their own leadership. And to me, it's a real delight. And it was a delight to be with you and talk about leadership. And my hope is that we can build more communities of belonging, and that becomes the norm, so that we can operate in spaces that feel more welcoming more safe, and ultimately more productive.
I'm so with you there. Awesome. Thank you again. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We shall see you all next week. Bye.